I arrived at the Carter estate before sunrise with 3 boxes of white magnolias sliding around in the back of my SUV and a pumpkin cheesecake balanced carefully on the passenger seat beside me. The sky over Savannah still looked bruised from the night before, dark blue melting slowly into gray, and my fingers ached from wiring floral garlands until nearly 2 in the morning. By 4 that afternoon, the dining room looked beautiful enough to belong in a magazine spread. Candles flickered against crystal glasses. Copper chargers glowed softly beneath cream-colored linen napkins. The entire house smelled like rosemary turkey, cinnamon butter, and the pine garlands I had wrapped around the staircase myself, and not one person had asked me to sit down. I didn't realize it at first. I was still adjusting the final centerpiece when Vanessa drifted into the dining room in a dark green silk dress that probably cost more than my first apartment. She smiled at me the way people smile at hotel staff when they want something done quickly but politely. "Oh, sweetheart," she said lightly, touching the edge of a place card. "We actually removed your seat. We figured you'd rather help coordinate desserts once dinner starts. You're just so good at these things." Everyone around the table chuckled softly. Not cruelly. That was the worst part. Even Ethan smiled distractedly as he poured bourbon into his father's glass, and before I could stop myself, before I could even fully process what had just happened, I smiled too. Automatic. Like my body had learned years ago that embarrassment should always be swallowed quickly before it made anyone uncomfortable. Then I heard Harper's voice from across the room. Quiet. Flat. 16 years old, and already tired. "They always do this to you." Something inside me went completely still. I wish I could say I immediately stood up for myself after that. I didn't. I picked up the tray of dinner rolls instead. That's the part I keep thinking about now, how natural it felt. The Carter estate sat just outside Savannah on a stretch of private land lined with old oak trees draped in Spanish moss. Ethan used to joke that the house looked like it belonged in one of those Southern historical dramas, where everybody had secrets and too much money. The truth was, his family didn't really keep secrets, they just buried things under good manners. By 8 in the morning, I was already unloading flower boxes from my car while Ethan stood near the driveway, laughing with his brother-in-law, Marcus, about football scores and bourbon labels. "Careful with those," I called as one of the boxes tilted sideways. Ethan glanced over briefly. "You got it!" I nodded automatically. He grabbed the bourbon crate first. I told myself not to think too much about that. Inside the house, Vanessa was directing catering staff while pretending she wasn't directing them. "That tray goes left, sweetheart." "No, no, candles lower." Oh goodness, somebody find Naomi. She always fixes these little details. I had been married to Ethan for 8 years, and somehow every Carter family holiday became my responsibility without anybody officially asking me to take responsibility for it. I handled flowers, place settings, desserts, guest lists, last-minute emergencies, and every year somebody called me a natural hostess, like it was a compliment instead of unpaid labor disguised as personality. "Naomi," Mrs. Carter said warmly as I passed through the kitchen carrying silverware, "I don't know what we'd do without you." I smiled, because women like me always smiled first. That afternoon passed in a blur of work. Vanessa rearranged 2 of my centerpieces without asking. Marcus handed me dirty glasses while I was still decorating the sideboard. Ethan interrupted me twice while I tried explaining the dinner timing to the caterers. "You know Naomi," he laughed to a group of relatives. "She can't relax unless she's organizing something." Everybody laughed softly again. And maybe it should sounded affectionate. Maybe another woman would have heard love in it. But standing there holding 3 folded linen napkins against my chest, all I heard was this "nobody here even notices when you disappear into service." At one point I stepped into the downstairs powder room just to breathe for a second. My feet already hurt. A strand of hair had fallen loose from my bun, and there was flour on the sleeve of my sweater. I stared at myself in the mirror longer than I meant to. Not because I looked unhappy, because I looked practiced, like somebody who knew exactly how to perform competence while slowly exhausting herself. When I came back downstairs, Harper was sitting alone on the staircase scrolling through her phone. "You okay?" I asked. She looked up at me for a second too long. "Are you?" Teenagers usually asked questions carelessly. Harper asked them like she already knew the answer. Dinner started just after 5. The dining room glowed gold under candlelight. Everybody admired the flowers. Mrs. Carter nearly cried over the magnolia arrangement running down the center of the table. Vanessa squeezed my arm gently. "You really do have a gift for making things beautiful." Then I noticed there were 11 place settings. 12 people in the room, no seat for me. At first, I honestly thought maybe another chair was still being brought in. Then I saw my place card, sitting folded beside the kitchen doorway. Vanessa noticed me looking. "Oh," she said brightly, "we assumed you'd be more comfortable helping once dessert starts. You're so much better moving around than sitting through long dinners anyway." Nobody reacted. That was the part that humiliated me most. Not one shocked face, not one awkward silence. Just acceptance. Like this had quietly become tradition years ago while I wasn't paying attention. I spent most of carrying platters between the kitchen and dining room, while conversations floated around me like background music. Business investments, vacation homes, college football, family trusts. At one point, a guest I didn't recognize smiled politely and asked me for extra wine, assuming I worked there. Before I could answer, Harper spoke from the table. She designed this entire dinner. The room went briefly quiet. Vanessa laughed too quickly. "Oh, Harper's in one of her moods today." Conversation resumed immediately after that, like my existence had been acknowledged, just long enough to become inconvenient. Later, Ethan caught me near the kitchen sink while I stacked dessert plates. "You okay?" he asked casually. "Of course," I said. "You got kinda quiet earlier. I almost laughed at that." Quiet, as if silence was suddenly new for me. As if I hadn't spent 8 years becoming smaller inside this family, one polite compromise at a time. By 9 that evening, everybody else sat in the living room watching football, while I wiped down serving trays in the pantry beside the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. My heels were off. My feet throbbed against the cold tile floor. I ate a slice of pumpkin pie standing up beside a stack of folded table linens while laughter drifted in from the next room. That was when Harper appeared in the doorway. She hesitated before speaking. Then she said quietly, "My grandmother told me, women only get treated like this when the men who love them decide it's easier not to notice." I froze with the fork halfway to my mouth. Not because she was wrong, because part of me had spent years working very hard not to think that exact thing myself. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up before Ethan even though I had barely slept at all. Rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows while the house still sat wrapped in that strange silence that comes after holidays. The kind filled with leftovers, dirty serving dishes, and emotional exhaustion nobody talks about out loud. I lay there staring into the ceiling, replaying Harper's voice over and over in my head. Women only get treated like this when the men who love them decide it's easier not to notice. Beside me, Ethan shifted under the blankets and reached lazily for me without opening his eyes. "You coming back to bed?" he mumbled. "I'm awake already." He finally looked over at me then, blinking slowly. "You okay?" There it was again, that question. Not, "Why did my family treat you that way?" Not, "Why didn't you have a seat at dinner?" Just, "You okay?" Like my hurt existed separately from the thing that caused it. "I'm fine," I said automatically. The words came out so quickly it almost scared me. Ethan sat up and rubbed a hand over his face. "Vanessa texted this morning. She thinks things got weird after dinner." I folded my blanket carefully before answering. "Things were weird. She didn't mean anything by it, Naomi." I looked down at my hands. That sentence had followed me through almost my entire marriage. She didn't mean it. He didn't mean it. They didn't mean it. As if intention erased impact. as if hurt only counted when someone admitted they wanted to cause it. Ethan stood and stretched before walking toward the bathroom. "Can you maybe smooth things over with her later?" he asked casually. "You know how tense she gets after family conflict." I actually laughed softly at that, not because it was funny, because somehow, even now, I had still become the person responsible for managing everybody else's emotions, including the people hurting mine. By noon, Ethan had left for work, and I stood alone in our kitchen staring at stacks of Thanksgiving containers I hadn't unpacked yet. I suddenly remembered another kitchen, another version of myself. I was 11 the first time somebody called me easy. My mother had been sick for months by then. Some autoimmune disorder doctors kept adjusting medications for, while my father worked longer and longer hours trying to keep us afloat. So I learned things: how to make soup, how to sort pills, how to keep laundry moving, how to lower my voice when adults looked tired. At family gatherings, relatives would pat my shoulder gently and smile. "Naomi's such an easy child." I used to feel proud hearing that. Easy meant helpful. Easy meant mature. Easy meant lovable. No one ever says as out loud that little girls sometimes becomes emotionally invisible because everybody rewards them for never needing anything. But that's exactly what happened to me. By the time I met Ethan at 26, disappearing inside relationships already felt natural. Back then, it even felt safe. Our first few months together had been effortless in a way that seemed romantic at the time. Ethan liked that I never argued over restaurants, never made scenes, never demanded attention. "You're calm," he used to say, kissing my forehead. "Being around you feels peaceful." I thought that was love. Now I wondered if maybe he just loved never feeling emotionally challenged by me. 3 days after Thanksgiving, Vanessa called while I was driving to a hotel installation downtown. "Naomi, sweetheart," she said brightly, "I volunteered to help with the Christmas fundraiser planning committee." Use. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "You volunteered me?" "Oh, don't sound irritated." She laughed lightly. "You're incredible at events. Besides, everybody always expects your touch." Everybody expected my labor. That was different. When I arrived at the Hamilton Crescent Hotel later that afternoon, everything inside me shifted automatically into work mode. The ballroom smelled faintly like fresh cider and champagne. My assistants were already unloading floral crates, while hotel staff hurried across polished marble floors carrying linens and lighting equipment. "Morning, Naomi," one of the coordinators called. "The clients loved your revised sketches." Another employee stopped me near the elevators. "Oh, good, you're here. We weren't starting layout decisions until you approved everything." People listened to me there, not politely, not indulgently, seriously. I moved through the ballroom, adjusting floral heights, directing installations, reviewing lighting angles, confident, clear, certain. At one point, my youngest assistant, Claire, looked at me with admiration so open it startled me. "I didn't realize you were the Naomi Carter everybody talks about," she said. I almost asked her what she meant, then realized she meant successful, respected, important. The words felt unfamiliar when connected to me outside work. Later that evening, I stopped at Aunt Delia's house in Charleston on my drive back from a supplier meeting. She opened the front door, wearing a soft, gray cardigan and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Well," she smiled warmly, "you look exhausted in a very expensive way." I laughed harder than I expected. Delia hugged me tightly before pulling back to study my face. "You apologize before every sentence," she said suddenly. "What?" "You walked through my door and apologized for being late, then apologized for bringing wine, because you thought it wasn't enough wine." I blinked at her. I was just being polite. "No," she said gently. "You were making sure your existence felt easy before taking up space in somebody else's home." The room went very quiet after that. Delia made tea while I sat at her kitchen table staring at the steam rising from my cup. "Can I ask you something?" she said carefully. I nodded. "Who taught you that love has to be earned through usefulness?" My throat tightened unexpectedly. because the terrible truth was, I couldn't remember a single relationship in my life where being needed and being loved had ever felt separate. That night, back at home, I waited nearly 40 minutes alone at a restaurant downtown because Ethan forgot we had plans celebrating my new hotel partnership. When he finally called, his voice sounded distracted. Baby, I'm so sorry. Vanessa needed help with donor seating charts and I completely lost track of time. I stared at the untouched second menu across from me. The hostess approached carefully a few minutes later. Would you like me to remove this setting for now? Something about the question almost broke me. Not because of the dinner, because suddenly I realized how often people quietly removed space for me, and how often I helped them do it. The Savannah Preservation Society Gala started before sunrise for me. By 6 in the morning, I was already standing inside the ballroom at the Wentworth Hotel with cold coffee in one hand and floral wire scratches running across my fingers like tiny paper cuts. Ladders surrounded the grand staircase while white orchids cascaded from gold installations nearly 12 feet high. Workers moved quickly across marble floors, carrying lighting rigs and linen samples, while soft jazz played faintly through the sound system during setup. Naomi, where do you want the crystal branches? One of my assistants called. Shift them 6 inches left, I answered automatically. And lower the hanging roses before noon, or the heat from the lights will wilt them. Nobody questioned me there. Nobody interrupted me halfway through sentences. Nobody smiled indulgently while ignoring what I said. People listened. A young intern carrying greenery stopped beside me around 8 that morning. You're Naomi Carter? She asked nervously. I nodded distractedly while reviewing placement sketches. Her eyes widened. Oh wow, I didn't realize you were the Naomi Carter everybody talks about. The comment caught me off guard enough that I actually laughed softly. Everybody talks about you. I tried imagining someone from Ethan's family saying something like that about me. The thought felt almost absurd. Around lunchtime, Vanessa arrived at the ballroom wearing oversized sunglasses and carrying the kind of effortless confidence wealthy Southern women seemed born, knowing how to perform. She walked slowly through the room looking up at the installations. Well, she said finally, this all turned out surprisingly elegant. Surprisingly. I swallowed the response sitting at the back of my throat. Vanessa linked her arm casually through mine as donors and committee members crossed the ballroom around us. I told everybody you'd make this place beautiful, she said proudly. You know, Ethan and I have really helped Naomi make wonderful connections over the years. I stared at her profile for a second, not because she was lying, because I honestly didn't think she realized she was. People like Vanessa rewrote reality gently, socially, so smoothly it's almost so true. I had built my business sleeping 4 hours a night for years. I had networked alone, designed alone, worked weekends alone, but somehow in her version of events, my success belonged partly to the Carter family narrative now. A few minutes later, I overheard her near the bar speaking quietly to another donor. She's incredibly talented, Vanessa said. A little sensitive emotionally sometimes, but creative people usually are. I stopped walking. Sensitive emotionally. That was how women got dismissed politely in rooms full of powerful people. Not difficult, not unstable, just emotional enough that nobody had to take them fully seriously. That evening, Ethan met me at home while I searched through garment bags for my dress. You ready for tomorrow? He asked. I think so. He loosened his tie and leaned against the doorway watching me. Vanessa said you seemed irritated today. I laughed once under my breath. Of course she did. She's trying, Naomi. No, I said quietly. She's managing perception. Ethan sighed immediately, already exhausted by tension before conflict had even fully started. Can we please not do this before the gala? There it was again. Not, are you hurt? Just, can we keep this comfortable? I looked down at the emerald dress hanging against the closet door. You know what's strange? I asked softly. What? I think strangers understand my work better than my own husband does. Ethan's expression tightened slightly. That's not fair. Maybe it wasn't. But it wasn't untrue either. The night before the gala, the family gathered at a seafood restaurant downtown overlooking the river. The entire table glowed under low amber lighting, while waiters moved between conversations carrying oysters and wine bottles. Vanessa dominated most of the discussion naturally. Marcus talked investments with Ethan. Mrs. Carter discussed Christmas fundraiser plans. Somebody mentioned a new country club membership list. I spent most of dinner listening. At one point, Ethan mentioned my business casually to a family friend. Naomi's been crazy busy lately, he said. She's doing weddings nonstop. I looked up slowly. Weddings. As if that was all, as if the hotel contracts, commercial installations, and luxury partnerships didn't exist. The family friend smiled politely at me. That sounds adorable, adorable. Something inside me quietly shut down after that. Not dramatically, just silently, like a room losing electricity one light at a time. Later, the waiter handed Ethan the wine list automatically, even though I was paying for dinner. Nobody noticed except Harper. She sat across from me, twisting her napkin between nervous fingers. When conversation shifted toward college plans, Vanessa smiled tightly at her daughter. Harper's applying to Vanderbilt, she announced proudly. A good Southern girl should stay connected to the right community. Harper stared down at her plate. What if I don't want that life? She asked quietly. The entire table paused. Vanessa laughed softly like the question was cute. Oh, sweetheart, everybody wants stability. Harper looked over at me then, not at her mother, me. And suddenly I understood something painful. She wasn't asking about college. She was asking whether women in this family were allowed to become themselves. That night after dinner, I stood alone on the hotel balcony outside our room, while cold December air curled around my bare arms. I called Aunt Delia before I could talk myself out of it. You sound tired, she said immediately. I think I'm disappearing, I'd whispered before I could stop myself. Silence settled softly on the other end. Then Delia said, some women become so useful that nobody remembers they're supposed to be loved too. My eyes burned unexpectedly. I don't even know when this started, I admitted. Oh, honey, she said gently. I think you were taught very young that being easy to love mattered more than being fully known. The gala the next evening looked breathtaking. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom shimmered beneath chandeliers and candlelight, while guests in black tuxedos and silk gowns filled the room with soft laughter and expensive perfume. And for the first time in years, I walked into a Carter family event without carrying trays. People recognized me immediately. Naomi Carter, we've been dying to meet you. Your work is extraordinary. I saw Ethan watching it happen from across the ballroom. Not jealous, confused, like he was meeting a version of me he didn't fully recognize. Then an elegant silver-haired woman approached me near the staircase. Mrs. Carter, she said warmly, extending her hand. I'm Eleanor Whitmore. I specifically came tonight hoping to meet the woman behind these installations. Vanessa appeared almost instantly beside us. Oh, Naomi's incredibly creative, but Eleanor barely looked at her. I've been following your work for months, she told me directly. Frankly, half the luxury hotels in Charleston are talking about you. I heard Ethan go quiet behind me, completely quiet. Then Eleanor turned toward him with a polite smile. You must be very proud, she said. How did your wife build one of the most respected design firms in coastal Georgia while staying nearly invisible in your family? Nobody answered. Not even me. Because standing there beneath all that golden light, watching Ethan stare at me like he was suddenly trying to understand who I really was, I realized something devastating. The loneliest part of my marriage wasn't that my husband failed to see me. It was that every time he almost did, he chose comfort instead. 3 weeks after the gala, the Carter estate looked like a Christmas postcard designed by someone who had never experienced loneliness a day in their life. White lights wrapped around every oak tree outside. Gold ribbon curled down the staircase. The entire house smelled like cedarwood candles and expensive bourbon, and somehow, despite everything that had happened at the gala, I still arrived 2 hours early carrying floral crates into the ballroom. Habit is a difficult thing to unlearn when people have spent years rewarding you for disappearing gracefully. "You're a lifesaver, Vanessa," called across the room as I adjusted arrangements beside the fireplace. Not, "Thank you for sponsoring tonight's fundraiser." Not, "Your company made this possible." Just lifesaver, like my value only existed in what I rescued for other people. The fundraiser brochures sat stacked near the entrance with my business logo, printed near the bottom, in lettering half the size of Vanessa's donor committee recognition. I stared at it longer than I should have. "You okay?" Ethan asked quietly beside me. I handed him the brochure. He glanced down. "I'm sure it wasn't intentional." That sentence again. Not intentional, not malicious, not meant that way. Funny how women are expected to survive death by 1,000 accidents. By 6 that evening, wealthy guests filled the estate laughing beneath chandeliers, while a string quartet played softly near the staircase. I wore a black velvet dress I almost didn't buy because it felt too noticeable, too elegant, too visible. But the second I entered the ballroom, several guests approached me immediately. "Mrs. Carter, your installations are stunning. We saw your work at the Whitmore Hotel. Are you taking clients in Charleston yet?" Every conversation made Vanessa tighter somehow. I noticed it in the sharpness of her smile, the way she interrupted too quickly, the way she kept introducing me vaguely. "This is my sister-in-law Naomi," she told one donor. "She helps us with events, helps us," as though my entire career existed as extension of her social calendar. Ethan heard it. I watched him hear it, and still he said nothing. Later, I found him near the library while waitstaff prepared dinner service. "I can't keep doing this," I said quietly. He rubbed his forehead immediately, already tense. "Doing what?" "Pretending this family respects me while they slowly turn me into unpaid staff every holiday. Naomi, no, listen to me for once." He glanced toward the ballroom nervously before lowering his voice. "Can we please not do this tonight? Vanessa's already stressed, and there are 200 people here." There it was again. The panic, not over my pain, over discomfort. I felt something inside me cool completely. "You always talk like conflict is the problem," I said softly. "Even when the real problem is what caused it." Ethan exhaled heavily. "I'm trying to keep the peace." I looked at him for a long second, and suddenly I realized something terrible. Men like Ethan thought peace meant nobody raising their voice, even if one woman quietly disappeared inside the silence. Dinner began just after 7:30. Long candlelit tables stretched across the ballroom, while donors and guests settled into their seats beneath crystal chandeliers. For the first time in months, I actually had a place card waiting for me beside Ethan. I noticed it immediately. My chest tightened unexpectedly at something so small, a seat. That was all it took to make me emotional now. Across the table, Harper caught my eye and smiled faintly like she noticed too. Maybe things are changing, I thought for one dangerous second. Then Vanessa stood with her wineglass, halfway through the first course. "Oh, goodness," she laughed brightly. "Naomi's, sweetheart, the kitchen needs help coordinating dessert timing. You're so much better at that than sitting through another donor speech." The room went still around me, not loudly, quietly, like people sensed something fragile about to crack. I looked at my untouched plate, then at Ethan. He avoided my eyes for half a second too long, and that was it. That tiny hesitation, that tiny instinct to stay comfortable. Something inside me finally gave out. I stayed seated. Vanessa blinked. "Well?" She laughed awkwardly. I looked at her calmly. "Why is it always my responsibility to disappear whenever this family needs something?" Complete silence. Somewhere across town, a crim silverware clinked softly against china. Vanessa forced a smile. "Oh God, Naomi, don't make this dramatic." "Dramatic?" I repeated quietly. My voice didn't shake anymore. "I spent Thanksgiving eating cold pie alone in a pantry while everyone else sat together at the table." Nobody moved. I looked slowly around the room. At every holiday, I cook, organize, clean, decorate, fix problems, smooth tension, and make everyone comfortable while pretending it's what I naturally enjoy. Mrs. Carter looked horrified. "That's not fair," she whispered. I turned toward her gently. "Then why does everybody here know exactly what I'm talking about?" No one answered, because they did know. Harper stared down at her lap, blinking quickly like she was trying not to cry. Vanessa's smile finally disappeared completely. "We treated you like family," she snapped. And suddenly I understood the entire problem. In this family, being treated like family meant becoming endlessly available. Useful, quiet, accommodating, easy. "You used to be so much easier," Vanessa said before she could stop herself. The words hung in the air like shattered glass. Even she looked startled after saying them. Beside me, Ethan finally spoke. Vanessa, but his voice lacked force, conviction, protection. And I realized with devastating clarity that he still wanted resolution without confrontation, still wanted harmony without accountability. I turned toward him slowly. "You loved how easy it was when I kept swallowing things that should have mattered." Pain flashed across his face immediately. "That's not true, isn't it? I thought I was keeping peace." "No," I said softly. "You were keeping everybody comfortable except me." Harper suddenly pushed her chair back hard enough that several guests jumped. "I recorded it," she blurted out shakily. Every head turned toward her. Her face had gone pale. "I recorded dinners sometimes because everybody always acted later, like Aunt Naomi imagined things." Vanessa stared at her daughter in disbelief. "Harper?" "No," Harper said, tears filling her eyes now. "You all do this." She looks hurt and everybody just waits for her to smile again so you don't have to feel bad. Nobody spoke, not even Ethan, because somewhere deep down, they all knew she was right. I looked around the ballroom one final time, at the candles, the polished silver, the carefully performed warmth, and suddenly the entire room felt unbearably exhausting. I stood quietly and placed my napkin beside my plate. Ethan followed me outside into the cold December rain before I even reached my car. "Naomi, wait." I turned toward him beneath the glow of the porch lights. Water soaked slowly into my hair while Christmas music drifted faintly through the open ballroom doors behind us. "I don't think you understand," I said quietly, "how lonely it feels to only be loved when you're easy." His face broke then, really broke, but for the first time in our marriage, I was too tired to comfort him for it. I drove to Charleston the morning after the fundraiser with swollen eyes, an overnight bag, and absolutely no idea what came next. The highway stretched gray and empty beneath a pale winter sky, while Savannah disappeared slowly behind me in the rearview mirror. Christmas stations still played softly through the radio, cheerful voices talking about holiday traditions and family memories, like those words belonged to everyone equally. 3 different times I reached for my phone to call Ethan. 3 different times I stopped myself, not because I didn't miss him, because for the first time in years, I didn't want to rush back into making somebody else comfortable before I fully understood how badly I'd been hurting. Aunt Delia opened the cottage door before I even reached the porch. "Oh, honey," she whispered the second she saw my face. That nearly broke me more than anything else had. Not because she pitied me, because she noticed. The guest cottage behind her house looked nothing like the Carter estate. No marble floors, no polished perfection, just warm lamplight spilling across old hardwood floors and books stacked unevenly beside soft blue armchairs. It felt lived in, safe. "You can stay as long as you want," Delia said gently while helping me carry my bag inside. I immediately answered, "I won't be any trouble." The words slipped out before I even thought about them. Delia stopped walking. Then she looked at me with the saddest expression I'd seen in a long time. "Naomi," she said quietly, "you are not a burden for existing in a room." I turned away too quickly after that because suddenly my throat hurt. The first few days in Charleston felt strangely uncomfortable, not emotionally dramatic, just unfamiliar. Nobody needed me to organize dinner. Nobody asked me to smooth over tension. Nobody handed me invisible responsibilities wrapped in compliments. The silence itself made me anxious. The first morning I woke up panicking because sunlight already filled the cottage windows. 8:30. I had overslept. My chest tightened immediately before I remembered. There was no event schedule waiting for me. No guests arriving, no family depending on me to keep everything moving quietly in the background. Still, guilt sat inside me like muscle memory. By the end of the week, Delia gently convinced me to see a therapist she knew in Charleston. During our second session, I apologized 4 times in under 10 minutes. Once for crying, once for rambling, once for probably sounding dramatic, and once simply because I needed a tissue. You describe love like employment, the therapist said carefully. I frowned. What does that mean? You talk about relationships in terms of usefulness, earning approval, managing comfort, preventing disappointment. I stared at the carpet for a long time after that. Because she wasn't wrong. Somewhere along the way, I had started believing love was something maintained through performance. If I stayed helpful enough, easy enough, pleasant enough, then people would keep me. Meanwhile, back in Savannah, Ethan started leaving voicemails almost daily. Not angry ones, worse, broken ones. Naomi, I watched the videos Harper recorded. Long silence. I didn't realize how often you stopped talking halfway through sentences because somebody interrupted you. Another voicemail came late one night. I keep seeing things now, things I should have noticed years ago. I listened to those messages, sitting alone on Delia's porch overlooking Charleston Harbor while cold ocean wind tangled my hair. And for the first time in my life, I didn't immediately rush to make someone feel forgiven before I felt healed. That was new too. Few weeks later, Ethan posted an article online celebrating my business expansion. My phone exploded with notifications instantly. So proud of my brilliant wife. Nobody works harder than Naomi. People flooded the comments with heart emojis and praise. I stared at the screen feeling absolutely nothing. Then unexpectedly, irritation, visibility without understanding still felt lonely. When I told Delia that, she nodded slowly. He's trying to repair guilt before fully understanding damage, she said. I think that was the moment I finally understood something important. Real change wasn't loud, it wasn't public, it was quiet, consistent, uncomfortable. Around February, I accepted an invitation to speak at a women entrepreneurs luncheon in Charleston. Normally, I would have declined something like that immediately. Too much attention, too much space. But standing backstage before the event, I realized something strange. I wasn't nervous about speaking. I was nervous about being listened to. The room filled with nearly 80 women that afternoon. Business owners, artists, restaurateurs, women rebuilding lives after divorce, illness, bankruptcy, grief. For once, nobody in the audience needed me to shrink first. Halfway through my speech, I caught myself about to apologize for talking too long. Then I stopped, actually stopped, and continued speaking anyway. Afterward, several women stayed behind to talk with me. One younger designer smiled warmly and said, "You make success sound peaceful instead of performative." I carried those words around for days afterward. Peaceful instead of performative. Maybe that was what I wanted now. Not admiration, not perfection, just a life where I no longer felt like I had to audition constantly for the right to exist comfortably inside it. A month later, I spotted Ethan standing quietly near the back of another luncheon event. He hadn't told me he was coming. He looked tired. Older somehow. But he didn't interrupt the evening by approaching me immediately. He sat silently through the entire presentation listening while I answered questions from the audience. Really listening. Afterward, we walked slowly along the Charleston waterfront while boats rocked gently against the docks below us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan finally said quietly, "I thought loving you meant making life easier for you." I looked out across the dark water. "No," I said softly, "you made life easier for yourself." He flinched like the words physically hurt. I know that now. Silence settled between us again. Then he asked the question I think neither of us had been brave enough to say before. What would loving you correctly have looked like? I stopped walking. The answer came out before I could soften it. You would have noticed I was disappearing long before I did. Ethan closed his eyes briefly after that, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't try to defend himself. By the following autumn, my life no longer looked recognizable from the outside, and for the first time in years, that didn't scare me. The Charleston studio opened on a quiet corner near the harbor in a restored brick building with tall windows and pale cream walls that smelled faintly like eucalyptus and fresh paint. Sunlight spilled across long wooden work tables where women gathered every weekend for floral workshops and design classes. Sometimes I still caught myself apologizing when someone waited for me to finish speaking. But now I noticed when I did it, and slowly I stopped. You've built something beautiful here, Delia told me one afternoon while watching students arrange late-season roses into antique glass vases. I looked around the studio carefully, not just at the flowers, at the atmosphere. Nobody rushed nervously to manage moods. Nobody competed for attention through quiet cruelty. Nobody disappeared. Women laughed openly there, rested openly there, so did I. By October, clients traveled from across Georgia and South Carolina to work with my company. My calendar stayed full without consuming entirely the way it used to. I started taking lunch breaks. I stopped answering emails at midnight. I bought art for my office simply because I liked looking at it. Small things. But after spending most of my adult life believing my comfort mattered least in every room, small things started feeling enormous. Ethan and I moved slowly after Charleston, painfully slowly sometimes. There were no dramatic speeches, no movie-style reconciliations, just uncomfortable honesty repeated consistently over time. He started therapy on his own, not because I demanded it, because for the first time in his life he realized avoiding discomfort had cost someone he loved her sense of self. One evening during dinner in Charleston, a waiter interrupted me mid-sentence to ask Ethan a question about the wine menu. Without thinking, Ethan looked back at him and said, "Actually, Naomi was speaking." The waiter apologized immediately. The moment itself lasted maybe 5 seconds, but I sat there afterwards staring quietly at my glass because my chest suddenly felt tight, not from sadness, from grief. For the version of me that once believed basic consideration counted as asking for too much. Vanessa, meanwhile, struggled with the fact that people no longer adjusted themselves automatically around her moods. Harper stopped helping at social events entirely unless she genuinely wanted to. Mrs. Carter slowly became quieter during family gatherings, like someone waking up years late inside her own life. Nobody openly exiled Vanessa from the family. That would have been too dramatic, too simple. Instead, people stopped rearranging reality to protect her comfort. And without that protection, her behavior suddenly looked exactly like what it had always been: lonely. By November, Harper visited Charleston twice a month. One afternoon, while helping me close the studio, she leaned against the counter and smiled. "You know what's weird?" she said. "What?" "You don't apologize after every opinion anymore." I laughed softly under my breath. "That bad, huh? It used to feel like you were asking permission to exist all the time." The honesty of that nearly knocked the air out of me, because children notice everything adults work hard to normalize. A week before Thanksgiving, Ethan called while I arranged white garden roses for a wedding installation. "There's something I want to ask you," he said carefully. I waited quietly. "Would you come to dinner this year?" The question itself sounded different from years before. No guilt, no pressure, no assumption, just a question. "If you don't want to," he added quickly, "I'll understand." I closed my eyes briefly after he said that, because I realized as something almost heartbreaking in its simplicity. That might have been the first time my comfort had ever been included in a Carter family invitation. Thanksgiving arrived cold and bright beneath a pale Savannah sky. Driving back up the long oak-lined road towards the estate felt strange, like revisiting a place where another version of me used to live. The house looked exactly the same, but I didn't. When I walked through the front doors, nobody handed me trays. Nobody asked me to organize seating. Nobody pointed toward the kitchen automatically. Harper hugged me first. A real hug, tight and immediate. "You look happy," she whispered. I think that was the moment I realized I actually was. Dinner began just after sunset. The same long mahogany table stretched beneath candlelight. Crystal glasses shimmered softly beside polished silverware while conversations drifted warmly through the room. And there, beside Ethan's chair, was my place setting. Not near the kitchen, not at the edge. Beside him, as I moved toward the table, one extra serving chair blocked part of my space slightly. Before I could adjust around it automatically, Ethan reached down quietly and moved it aside. No announcement, no performance, just awareness. Something inside me softened painfully at that, because that was what love was supposed to feel like all along. Not grand gestures. Consideration. Halfway through dinner, I started explaining plans for expanding the Charleston studio into mentorship programs for younger women entering design work. Old habits almost repeated instantly. Marcus interrupted. Someone else started another conversation. Voices overlapped mine. And for one split second, I felt myself beginning to shrink again automatically. Then Ethan said calmly, "Hold on. I want to hear what Naomi was saying." The room fell quiet naturally after that, not tense, not annoyed, just quiet enough for me to continue. I looked down at my hands while speaking and suddenly realized something strange. They weren't shaking anymore. For years, every family dinner had felt like standing on stage, waiting to become inconvenient. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I belonged inside my own voice. Later that evening, Ethan and I stood alone on the back porch while soft laughter drifted through the windows behind us. Cold November air curled around us while oak branches swayed gently overhead. "I'm ashamed it took me so long to really see you," he admitted quietly. I looked out across the dark lawn. "I think I stopped seeing myself long before that," I said. He nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, he said something I don't think I'll ever forget. "You were never asking for too much space, Naomi. Everybody else just got too comfortable asking you to live with less." My eyes burned immediately, because that was it. That was the entire story. For most of my life, I thought love meant becoming useful enough that nobody would leave me behind. But real love was never supposed to feel like disappearing quietly while everybody else stayed comfortable. Maybe real love is simpler than that. Maybe it's just someone making room for you before you have to beg for space. And if you've ever been the person holding everything together while quietly feeling invisible at the same time, I'd really love to hear your story in the comments. If this story touched something personal for you, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who may need this reminder today, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about family, healing, self-worth, and the quiet moments that change our lives forever.